The county had tried to find her a new situation 3 times in 18 months. The first rancher had said she did not fit the household, which was the polite version of what he meant, which was that his household was a loud household. 3 sons, a working dog, 2 hands who ate supper with the family, and she had sat at that table for 6 weeks and had not contributed to the noise, and the noise had eventually decided she was not there, and not being there was not useful in a loud household. The second rancher had said she was too reserved for the children, which was another version of the same thing, which was that the children had wanted a woman who responded to them with the animated engagement they were accustomed to, and she had responded to them with the full attention of a person who was listening rather than performing the listening. And the children had not known the difference, and had reported to their father that the woman was strange, and the father had believed the children. The third rancher had said, she seemed withdrawn, which was the most honest version, which was that withdrawn was the word the county used for a person who was not performing adequacy in the way the county recognized adequacy as being performed, and she was not performing it because performance was not a mode she operated in. She was not withdrawn. She was Mercy Crane, and she was 36, and she had been managing her husband's small operation on the South Weller Range for 4 years before he died, which was 4 years of learning the specific grammar of a working cattle operation. What the land needed and when, what the herd indicated and what to do about what it indicated, what the supply contract said and what they should say, what the accounts revealed and what they concealed. She had learned all of this alongside her husband, which meant she had learned it in the way that things were learned alongside people who were doing the work rather than teaching it, which was that the learning was embedded in the doing and was therefore more durable than the learning that came from instruction. Her husband had died in March, and she had continued managing the operation, because the operation needed managing, and she was the person who knew how to manage it, and the managing had been correct. She had done the calving and the spring rotation, and the supply renegotiation, and the account review, and the summer grazing, and the fall herd count, and she had done all of it alone, and the operation had stayed sound. And she had known it would stay sound because she had been doing half of the work for 4 years, and had understood the whole of it well enough to absorb the half she had not been doing. The county had not seen this the way she had experienced it. The county had seen a widow on a small operation and had decided the widow was a problem to be solved rather than an operation manager to be left alone, and the deciding had produced a series of conversations in which the county's intentions had been good and the county's reading of the situation had been wrong. And she had engaged with the conversations with the same quality she brought to everything, which was full attention and minimal performance. And the county had read the minimal performance as passivity and had prevailed. She had sold the operation in the autumn, and the listing had described it as sound, which was accurate, and she had been in the county placement process since, which had produced 3 rejections for being too quiet and a room at the Dunmore Exchange Hotel that she had been in for 6 weeks. In the 6 weeks she had been at the Exchange Hotel, she had read every county agricultural report she could find in the Dunmore reading room, and she had organized her knowledge of the South Weller operation systems in a document she kept in her bag, not because she expected to use it, but because the organizing was how she processed the ending, which was to put it in order before she put it down. She had been putting it in order for 6 weeks, and it was in order, and she had put it down, and then Seld had sent word about the Greer placement, and she had gone to the office, and she had arrived on a Thursday in November, exactly as she was. Her name, again, was Mercy Crane, and she was the most observant person in the county, and the county had not noticed. His name was Nate Greer, and he ran cattle on the East Weller Range, and he was 42, and he had been widowed for 2 years and had been managing the operation alone since, which meant there was work that was not being done because one person could not do everything, and the work that was not being done was accumulating the way deferred work accumulated, which was invisibly at first and then all at once. He had heard about Mercy Crane not from the county placement office but from his east fence line, which shared a section with the South Weller operation that she had been running, and in the years before her husband had died and in the 18 months after, he had been aware of the South Weller operation the way you were aware of a neighbor's operation, at a distance, through occasional encounters at the boundary line, through the general quality of the land at the edge you shared. The South Weller operation had been in good condition when her husband was alive and had continued to be in good condition after he died. And Nate had noted this without particularly noting it, the way you noted the continued sound condition of a neighbor's operation, as a background fact rather than a specific observation. He had gone to the placement office in November, not to ask about Mercy Crane specifically, but because the operation needed managing, and the placement office was where you went for that. And Seld had told him about the available placements and had mentioned Mercy Crane with the specific tone of a man who had been rejected 3 times and was managing his expectations. And Nate had asked what was the specific reason for the rejections. Seld had said she was too quiet. Nate had said he would take the placement. Seld had said he understood the man might not have fully. Nate had said he would take the placement. She arrived on a Thursday in November with a bag and the particular quality of a person who had been assessed and found wanting 3 times and had decided the 4th assessment was not going to be performed differently, which was to say she arrived exactly as she was. She stood at the gate and she looked at the operation with the assessing eye she brought to every new place, which was quick and comprehensive and without performance. And what she saw was an operation that was sound in its cattle management and behind in its household that had a specific cause, which was a man who had been doing the cattle management and the household management both, and who had been pronoticing correctly, and the household management was the part that had accumulated the deferral. He showed her the house and the kitchen and the supply room and the accounts desk and the room at the end of the hall, and he said the supply contracts needed reviewing and the accounts had a format problem he had not had time to address, and the kitchen garden had been let go since September and would need attention in the spring. He said all of this, and she listened, and she did not say anything, and he did not require her to say anything because the information was complete and did not require a response. And they went to the kitchen, and he made coffee, and they sat at the table. He said he was going to tell her what he had heard about her, and then he was going to say what he thought about what he had heard. She looked at him with the full quality of her attention, which was an attention that other people sometimes found unsettling because it had no social management, no softening expressions, no anticipatory nods, and which was simply the complete direction of her awareness at the thing in front of her. He said he had heard she was too quiet for 3 placements, and each one had been a different household, and each one had given the same reason. And he said that 3 different households giving the same reason was usually evidence that the reason was accurate, and he wanted her to know he had heard it. She said she appreciated that. He said he also wanted to tell her what he thought about it. She waited, and the waiting had the same quality as the attention, complete and unhurried, and without performance. He said he had watched the South Weller operation run correctly for 4 years while her husband was alive and for 18 months after he died, and a quiet person had been running it for the entirety of that time, and the quiet had not prevented the operation from running correctly. And the only thing the quiet had prevented was the people around her from noticing that she was the one running it. She was quiet for a moment. He said he was not done. She waited. He said the South Weller operation had gone on the market in the autumn, and he had read the listing, and the listing had said the operation was in sound condition, and operations did not stay in sound condition for 18 months after a death by themselves. And he said he knew who had kept it sound. She said she had kept it sound. He said he knew. She said the county had decided she could not manage it alone. He said the county was wrong. She received this in the specific way she received things that had been said correctly for the first time, which was completely and without deflecting and without the immediate production of a response, because she needed a moment to place it. He said there was one more thing. He said he had been walking his east fence line in August and had found a section of his fence that had been repaired from the South Weller side, and the repair was competent and the stapling pattern was her pattern, which he had recognized because he had seen it on her side of the fence line for years. And he had not asked anyone about it because he had not needed to know, and he was telling her now because it was relevant. She said the section had been down since June, and she had repaired it from her side because a down section was a down section and the cattle did not know whose side of the line the gap was on. He said he knew that too. He said he had not asked because a person who repaired a neighbor's fence from the wrong side without being asked was a person who understood that the work was the work, regardless of whose it was, and that kind of person did not need to be asked to explain themselves. She looked at him for a long time. She said she had been assessed 3 times in 6 months, and each time the assessment had been for how much noise she made. He said he knew. She said she was not going to make more noise. He said he was not asking her to. This is Dusty Vows, where stories live like theirs. Women who had been assessed for the wrong qualities by people who were listening for the wrong things. Men who had been watching the south fence line and knew what they knew. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then back to the ranch. She worked the way she worked, which was without announcement. The supply contracts were reviewed in the first week, and she presented the findings to him in writing on a single page, with 3 items marked. And he read the page and asked 2 questions, and she answered them, and the contracts were renegotiated. The account's format problem was identified and corrected in the second week. The problem had been that the cattle operation accounts and the household accounts had been kept in separate ledgers with different organizational logics, which produced accurate records in each ledger and an invisible relationship between the two. And the invisibility meant the household's actual draw on the operations budget was not legible unless you translated between the 2 systems, and translating between 2 systems was work that required the system builder to be present. She consolidated the 2 ledgers into a single format that made the full picture visible, and she documented the consolidation process in detail so he could maintain it without her if the arrangement ended. He noticed the documentation of the consolidation process, and he came to the kitchen in the second week, and he said she had documented the format change so he could continue it himself. She said she always documented changes to the systems she built. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because a system that only she could run was a dependency rather than a system, and dependencies were liabilities, and she did not build liabilities into the places she worked." She said she had been in placements that had failed, and she had left each one correct, and the correctness of what she left was the only record she had, and she kept it clean. He said he had been aware of that. He said the South Weller operation had been in the listing as sound, and he had thought about what it meant that the listing was accurate. She said what it meant was that she had done her work. He said it meant more than that. He said an operation that sold as sound 18 months after its owner died was an operation that had been run by someone who understood the work as its own end, rather than as a performance for an audience. And running work as its own end without an audience was harder than it sounded, because most people needed the audience to maintain the standard. He said the audience was what held most people to full standard work, the knowledge of being watched, the social consequence of visible failure, and doing the work at full standard without the audience was a different kind of discipline than doing it in front of others. She looked at him. He said she did not need the audience. She said she did not. He said that was the thing the other households had heard as too quiet. She said yes. She said she had understood for some time that what the household had been assessing her for was not the quality of her work, but the quality of her performance of the work. And she had been providing the work at full standard and the performance at minimum. And the minimum performance had read as absence to people who were using performance as the signal for presence. He said he had not been using performance as the signal. She said she knew. She said she had known it from the first Thursday, which was when he had told her what he had heard, and then told her what he thought about it, and the distinction between what he had heard and what he thought had been the first evidence that he was reading from the work, rather than from the performance of the work. He said that was the most precise description of what he had been doing that he had heard. She said she tended toward precise. "Tell me," when he said she did not need the audience. And she said she did not, and he said that was the thing the other households had heard as too quiet. Did you understand that he was naming it correctly for the first time? Not a deficit, a capacity. She worked at full standard without anyone watching. That is not absence. That is something else entirely. Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone now. Back to the ranch. The thing she noticed about him took 3 weeks to identify, which was 3 weeks longer than it usually took her to identify the thing about a place. But the thing about him was more subtle than the things about most places. What she had noticed in every household she had been in was the gap between what the household said it needed and what the household actually needed. And the gap was usually visible in the first week, if you were paying attention, and she was always paying attention, and in each of the 3 failed placements the gap had been visible, and she had addressed it, and the addressing had not been noticed, because she had addressed it quietly. The first household's gap had been between what the rancher said he wanted, a household manager who would integrate with the family, and what the family actually needed, which was someone who would attend to the administrative work the wife had been doing in addition to the social work. And no one had told her about the administrative work because no one had known they were missing it, until she found the 3 months of unreviewed supply invoices in the desk drawer, and reviewed them and found 2 billing errors and corrected them. And she had corrected them quietly, and the corrections had not been noticed, and the household had continued to think she was not fitting. The second household's gap had been between what the rancher said he needed and what the children actually needed, which was not performance but consistency. And she had been consistent with the children in the way she was consistent with everything, which was without variation and without announcement. And the children had experienced the consistency as quiet and had reported it as strange because they did not have the vocabulary for quiet as a form of consistency. She had understood what they needed and had continued providing it, and the household had continued to not notice that the provision was happening. The third household had not had a gap that she could identify, which meant the gap had been in the household's ability to read what it was receiving, and that was not a gap she could address. The thing about Nate Greer was that his gap was different from the household gap she had been in before, because his gap was not between what he said he needed and what he needed. He said he needed the accounts and the supply and the house, and he needed exactly those things, and she was providing them, and the provision was correct. His gap was different. His gap was between what the operation had been and what it was, which was not a household gap, but a man gap, which was the gap between the operation of a man who had a partner in the work and the operation of a man who did not. And the gap was not in the accounts or the supply or the house. It was in the specific quality of a decision being made in real time with no one to think the decision against. She had watched him at the accounts desk in the 3rd week for 2 evenings, and she had understood the gap. He made good decisions, and he made them alone, and the alone was the thing that cost him something, not the deciding, but the alone. And the cost was not visible in the accounts or in the herd condition or in the supply arrangement. It was visible in the specific quality of the pause before a decision was made, which was longer than the pause of a man who was thinking and shorter than the pause of a man who was uncertain. And she had learned to read that pause in 18 months of running the South Weller operation after her husband died because she had been making that pause herself. She came to the accounts desk on a Thursday in December. She said she had been watching him make decisions for 3 weeks, and she had a question. He set down the pen. She said she was not asking about the decision on the desk. She said she was asking about whether he would be willing to talk through a decision before he made it, not because the deciding needed correction, but because she had been making decisions in that specific quality of alone for 18 months, and she had found that thinking the decision against another person produced a different quality of decision than thinking it alone. And she was offering to be the person he thought it against if he wanted. She said she understood. If the offer was unusual, he looked at her. He said the offer was unusual, but he understood what she was describing. She said she had thought he might. She said she had been watching him at the accounts desk for 2 evenings, and she had recognized the pause. And the pause was the same pause she had been making for 18 months. And the pause was not uncertainty and was not slowness, but was the specific pause of a decision being made without something to make it against. And she had been making it alone, and she had found the alone to be the costlier part. He said, what was the thing she had been making decisions against when she was alone? She said for the first year she had been making them against her husband's thinking, which was possible because she had known his thinking well enough to reconstruct it. And the reconstruction had been accurate for a year. She said in the 2nd year it had become a habit rather than a thought, which was the distinction between remembering and thinking. And habits were less useful than thoughts because habits could not be surprised by new information. He said so she had been making decisions against the habit for 6 months. She said, yes. She said that was the period in which she had been most careful about the decisions because she had known the reconstruction was becoming unreliable and she had tried to compensate by slowing down, and the slowing down was part of what had produced the pause he had been observing. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man receiving information that was both specific and large. He said he had a decision on the desk now and she could start with that one if she was willing. She sat down across the desk. He talked through the decision, which was about the spring grazing rotation on the north section, and the specific question of whether to move the northeast herd to the west section in April or to hold the northeast section through May, and make the move in June when the west section had more grass than the northeast. He talked through it in the way she had seen him do everything, which was directly and without performance, and with the relevant information presented in the order that made the decision legible. She listened, and the listening was the full quality of her attention. Not waiting for him to finish, not preparing a response while he was speaking, but actually receiving what he was saying in the way she received everything, which was completely and with the full weight of her consideration. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said 2 things. She said the west section's water access in April would depend on the winter snowpack, and the current snowpack was light, which meant April water in the west section was less reliable than in a normal year. She said the northeast section's grass condition in May would depend on the March temperature pattern, and the March temperature pattern in the East Weller Range was historically variable in the specific direction that made late grazing riskier than early. He looked at her. She said she was not telling him to move in April or to wait until June. She said those were the 2 pieces of information she had that he had not included in his thinking, and what he did with them was his decision. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made the decision, which was to move in April with a contingency plan for the water access. And the decision had the shape that decisions had when they had been made against something real, which was that it was precise rather than approximate. He said that was useful. She said good. He said, had she wanted someone to think her decisions against when she had been running the South Weller operation alone? She said yes. She said she had been running that operation against the memory of her husband's thinking, which was a version of the thing but not the same as the actual thing, and the memory had been reliable for about a year, and it started to become a habit rather than a thought in the 2nd year, and habits were less useful than thoughts. He was quiet for a long time in the way she had come to understand as his way of receiving something that was both simple and large. He said she had been thinking her decisions against a memory for 18 months. She said yes. He said that was a long time. She said it was. He looked at the desk and the accounts and the spring grazing rotation decision, and then he looked at her. He said he wanted to say something and he was going to say it directly because indirectly was not his mode. She waited with the full quality of her attention, which was the quality that had been called absence by 3 households who did not know what presence actually sounded like. He said she had been in 3 placements and turned away from each for being too quiet, and he had been the 4th placement, and he had listened to what the quiet was, which was not absence but the specific fullness of a person who worked at full standard without an audience and thought decisions against whatever was available to think them against. And he had been available to think decisions against for 3 weeks now, and he intended to keep being available. And he wanted her to know that the keeping yelled was not a comment on the placement and not a comment on the contract. It was a comment on the 3 weeks of December and the fence section repaired in August and the South Weller operation. That had been listed as sound in the documentation she left, so the system survived her leaving. She was quiet for a moment in the way that was her way, which was the full weight of consideration applied to something that had arrived and needed to be placed correctly. She said she understood the difference between available as a courtesy and available as the actual thing, and she said what he was describing was the actual thing. He said he was glad she could hear the difference. She said she could always hear the difference. She said that was the thing that most people had not understood about her, which was that quiet was not the absence of perception, it was the presence of it without the noise that usually came with it, and the absence of the noise did not mean the absence of the receiving. and she had been receiving everything for 3 years of the South Weller operation, and 6 months of placements, and 3 weeks at the Greer spread, and she had received what he had just said, and it was the most accurate description of the available she had heard. He said she had been hearing everything all along. She said yes. He looked at her. Mercy. Her name in his mouth, the first time with the full weight of it, said the way a name was said when it had been accumulating weight since August, and had reached its full measure in December, in a kitchen that was warm and correct, and running in the format that made the full picture visible. She waited. I'm not going anywhere. She said it the way she did everything, which was without performance and without the management of effect, in the voice of a woman who had been assessed 3 times for the wrong qualities and had arrived at the 4th assessment exactly as she was and had been seen correctly. And the being seen correctly was worth staying for. She held his gaze. Every rancher turned me away for being too quiet, and you were the first to listen. And what you heard was the work, and the work is what I am, and I am not going anywhere. As if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Nate Greer, her name for him, said the way a word sounded when it had been the name of the neighbor on the east fence line, and had become the name of the person across the accounts desk who had heard the quiet correctly and had offered his thinking in return. He nodded once. The matter was settled. Outside, the December was doing what December did, and inside, the kitchen was warm, and the accounts were correct, and the supply contracts were renegotiated, and the consolidation was documented, and the spring grazing rotation was decided, and the east fence line ran sound between the 2 operations. And Mercy Crane was at the desk, and she was not going anywhere. They had each been making decisions alone for too long, and the alone had produced a specific quality of pause before each decision. And the pause had been the gap, and the gap had been filled by the offering and the accepting of the one thing that had been missing from each of them, which was a person to think the decisions against who was actually there. And actually there was different from remembered and different from performed, and was the thing itself, and the thing itself was here, and she was staying, and the quiet was not absence and had never been, and the first person to hear it correctly had been listening since August, when he had found the fence section repaired from the wrong side. And the wrong side had been the right side, and the repair had held, and so would this. The county had called her too quiet in 3 placements, and the word had been wrong all 3 times, and was wrong now. And what was correct was what he had said in the kitchen on the first Thursday, which was that the quiet had not prevented the operation from running correctly. The only thing it had prevented was the people around her from noticing who was running it. He had noticed. He had been noticing since August. The noticing was going to continue, and she was going to continue, providing the thing that was worth noticing, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the accounts were correct, and the decisions were being made at the right quality, and the east fence was sound, and the spring rotation was decided, and Mercy Crane was staying. And the December was outside, and the kitchen was warm, and the quiet was full of everything it had always been full of, and now there was someone in the room who could hear it. She had not needed the audience for 18 months, and she did not need it now, but there was a difference between not needing an audience and not wanting a person who was actually there, and the person who was actually there was across the accounts desk, and he had told her what he had heard, and what he thought about what he had heard, and what he had thought was accurate, and the accuracy was the thing she had been looking for without knowing she had been looking for it, and she had found it in December, and December was going to become January, and January was going to become the spring, and the spring rotation was going to be executed correctly, and she was going to be there for it, and so was he, and the quiet between them was going to be the right kind of quiet, which was the kind that was full rather than empty, and she was staying, and the east fence line between what had been the South Weller operation and the Greer operation was going to be tended from both sides, and both of them were going to be there, and the repair was going to hold. She had been the most observant person in the county for 18 months of running the South Weller operation alone, and for 6 months of placement rejections, and for 3 weeks at the Greer spread. And the county had not noticed, and the 3 placements had not noticed, and he had noticed, and the noticing had been the thing. And the thing was in the kitchen in December, and neither of them was going anywhere. And the quiet was correct, and the work was being done, and the decisions were being made against something real. and the reel was here, and Mercy Crane was staying, and the east fence was sound, and the repair had held since August, and everything that followed from August was going to hold as well, and that was the whole arithmetic, and it was correct. 3 placements had turned her away for being too quiet, and the word had been wrong each time, and the word that was right was the word she had used to describe her own work, which was that it was its own end. And its own end was what it had always been, and now there was a person in the same place who understood that the quiet was full rather than empty, and who had been listening since August, when he had found the fence section repaired from the wrong side of the line, and had understood who had repaired it and why. And the understanding was the beginning of this, and this was the kitchen in December with the accounts correct, and the spring rotation decided, and the east fence sound, and she was staying, and both of them were going to be there for every spring that followed, and the quiet was going to keep being full. And neither of them was going anywhere, and the quiet was full, and the quiet had always been full, and the fullness was here, and the east fence was going to be tended from both sides for a very long time, and that was enough. And it was more than enough, and both of them were staying, and the December was doing exactly what December always did outside the window, and the warm kitchen was holding everything in, and nothing was going anywhere,